I thought what might be most appropriate to talk with you about is how our Army is innovating, right? And innovating has become kind of the new buzzword, but we define it in the Army operating concept as turning ideas into valued outcomes, and to turn those ideas into valued outcomes at a pace that is faster than very determined and adaptive enemies, right? So there's a qualitative aspect to it. We really have to focus on the right priorities to develop the right capabilities to our force to maintain overmatch over our enemies, right? Because we don't want any fair fights. We know that, in combat, a fair fight means barely winning, and barely winning is an ugly proposition. And so we're looking for opportunities to make sure that as our Army gets smaller, that our Army can move faster, hit harder, and accomplish the mission across the range of military operations. And there's also a temporal aspect of it as well. So there's a qualitative and a temporal aspect. The temporal aspect is we have to do it faster than the normal system would deliver capabilities. Because now, especially with the cycle of technology, we have to innovate at least faster than that cycle of technology. And so what I'd like to talk to you about is how the Army is thinking about future war, how the Army is then learning about future armed conflict and the capabilities that we need, how we analyze really what we're learning so that we can then implement through Army systems and through Army leadership decisions. And so first of all, the way we're thinking about future war is to lay a conceptual foundation for Army modernization. And you received, I think, the read ahead, the highly readable, page-turning, Army operating concept, So if you haven't read it, there's still time to take it to the beach with you before ski season to take with you. But I mean, I really hope you'll take a look at it, because it's important for us to define really how we see the problem of future war and how the Army is going to operate as part of joint, interorganizational, multinational teams to accomplish the mission in the future. And so we took really a page out of General Starry's book in terms of thinking about future armed conflict, and we considered really four main factors. The first of these are threats, enemies, and adversaries in the operating environment. And so as we think about future war, we have to, if we're going to innovate, we have to innovate really to do something, right? So we have to think clearly about the threats we're going to face in the future, the enemies we're going to face in the future. So the Army operating concept names, nation states that we see as threats to our national interests, potential threats to our national interests. And we recognize up front in the Army operating concept that threats to our security and to our interests come both from nation states, state actors, and the fielded forces of nation states, and also come from non-state and so-called hybrid actors as well. And we recognize that all of these threats really are essentially doing four things overall to contend with what they see as U.S. capabilities. And the overall banner of this might be really, there are two ways to fight the U.S. military, asymmetrically and stupid. And you hope the enemy picks stupid, but they're likely not to pick stupid. So we see our enemies evading what they see as our overmatch capabilities, right? They evade those capabilities with traditional countermeasures, dispersion, concealment, intermingling with civilian populations, and deception. They are disrupting what we see as our capabilities, right? Especially our standoff capabilities, our ability to identify the enemy from standoff range and conduct precision strikes. And we see some of those capabilities in eastern Ukraine today, for example, right? Sophisticated, really not even that sophisticated, but electronic warfare, cyber capabilities, UASs tied to area fires, for example, and how these sorts of capabilities can challenge what has been our advantage in precision strike capabilities, for example. Our enemies are, besides avoiding or evading and disrupting our capabilities, they emulate our capabilities. And what we're seeing now is the ease of technology transfer, right, to our adversaries. In fact, technology is probably the element of our differential advantage over future enemies that is most transferable to our enemies, right? So we have to consider the technologies we need to make us more effective, but we also have to consider enemy countermeasures and technological capabilities that they're developing. And so what we say in the Army operating concept, for example, is our differential advantage comes from combinations, right, of well-trained soldiers, cohesive teams, and adaptive leaders with technology. And this is why the Army can't just focus on a couple of discrete technologies and say, hey, this is what's going to give us our advantage. We have to develop a broad range of technological capabilities that can be used in combination to seize, retain, and exploit the initiative over determined and capable enemies. And then finally, what we see our enemies doing is expanding onto other battlegrounds. You know, the physical battleground, certainly, and we see that, right? I mean, we see, what are the fights over these days, right? The fights are over the control of territory and people. ISIL has, or Daesh has established a terrorist proto-state in the greater Middle East and is consolidating control of territory and populations. The fight in Ukraine is what? It's a fight over territory and people, and where Russia has been able to conduct a limited war for limited objectives, right? To gain control of eastern Ukraine at no cost to them, zero cost, consolidate control over that territory, and then portray our response and our allies' response as escalatory. So what's important, I think, for us to recognize is that this fight is about the physical battlegrounds of people and territory, but our enemies to pursue their objectives employ sophisticated strategies and operate very effectively on the battleground of information and perception. I mean, how strong militarily really is Daesh? I mean when Ramadi collapsed, how many Daesh fighters came into Ramadi? I mean, not many. They were very effective at psychological operations, and they're very effective on the battleground of perception. And they also operate effectively on the battlegrounds of political subversion and so forth. So if that's the threats that we're facing, you know, the implication for us is we have to operate across all those battlegrounds. We have to deal with capable, elusive, and determined enemies. And we have to, as we think about these enemies, we have to do so in the context of realistic scenarios based on a grounded projection of the future. So threats, enemies, and adversaries, and this is a shift from the old capabilities-based approach where we were sort of imagining the kind of capabilities we would need in the future, independent a little bit of threats. And so this is the key element of our thinking and laying a conceptual foundation. The second is missions. The sorts of missions we're going to have to conduct in the future. And of course, you know, to deter enemies, you know, you can take two really fundamental approaches to deterrence, right? One is deterrence by the threat of punitive measures, right? So if you do something, I'm going to punish you from afar, for example. Or you can take the approach of deterrence by denial, right? To have the capabilities, to have the capacity in our joint force that can communicate to the enemy that they can't accomplish their objectives. It's impossible for them to accomplish their objectives. And if you're waging, you know, if you're trying to deter an enemy that's waging limited war for limited objectives, forward deterrence, ratcheting up the cost at the frontier is what works. And how do we know that? I mean, we've done it for 70 years, right? I mean, what the joint force has been able to do is relied in large measure on land forces positioned forward as part of joint teams to deter great power conflict for 70 years. It's what we've done on the Korean Peninsula since 1953. And so the idea that somehow now you can shift to a deterrence mission and do it exclusively at standoff range, I just don't think it stands up to any degree of scrutiny. So we emphasize this in the Army operating concept, the need to prevent conflict as well as to respond to and resolve crises. And so the other aspect of missions that we're emphasizing is expeditionary maneuver. And what expeditionary maneuver is, it's not just getting there, right, but it's getting there with a force that has the appropriate combination of mobility, protection, and lethality, and is capable of operating in sufficient scale and ample duration to accomplish the mission, right? And so this is a force that can get there and transition quickly into operations. And this is driving, you know, a lot of what we're doing in technological development, a lot of DOTML PF solutions to really expeditionary maneuver. And then joint combined arms maneuver, which is the integration of all joint capabilities, multinational capabilities, interorganizational capabilities to seize, retain, and exploit the initiative over determined enemies across all those battlegrounds. And then the other big idea that in the operating concept that's driving change is the need to consolidate gains, right? The Army has always had to consolidate gains, and so that's another big aspect of future missions. The third is technology, and this is technology that will enable our operations. So if you think about expeditionary maneuver, right, we're emphasizing the need to get mobility to those forcible and early entry forces immediately, right? We don't want to deploy a force from strategic distance and have it immobilized upon arrival, right? And we want that force to be able to overmatch the enemy. You know, unless we're going there to reenact World War I, we need to get mobile protected firepower there, right? And we need to be able to ensure freedom of movement and action of our infantry formations in close contact with the enemy, again, who are going to fight us asymmetrically and are going to be elusive in restrictive and urban terrain. So this, you can see how some requirements on this end are related back to the ideas in the Army operating concept. But we have to consider enemy countermeasures as well, right? We've built an exquisite network. It's an exquisite network, though, that is vulnerable, right, to enemy counteraction. And so we're seeing that. We're getting glimpses of that in Ukraine. And we're identifying that as a capability gap and doing everything we can to simplify, protect, and complete our network, for example. So technology. And then finally, history and lessons learned. You know, we learn enthusiastically in our Army, right? But a lot of times we don't learn with a lot of finesse, right? And we learn repetitively instead of cumulatively. So as we've thought about future war and we develop the ideas under sort of thinking about the future and laying the conceptual foundation using General Don Starry's model of these 4 areas, we also add an area of assets and opportunities. How can we use assets we have today in a more opportunistic way? And these all feed in to our concept. Now, what's important about this concept is it's a starting point, right? It's not the answer, right? It's not going to tell us everything we need to know about future operations. But what it's meant to do is frame the problem of how to make sure that our Army is capable of operating in sufficient scale, ample duration, with the right capabilities to accomplish future missions. So this is where learning comes in, which is key, right? Any innovative organization is a learning organization. And so to learn, the first thing you have to do is ask the right questions. So one of the handouts you have today on the Army warfighting challenges, those are 20 really first-order questions, the answers to which will improve current and future force combat effectiveness. That's our framework for learning across our Army. And then we match that framework, which includes not just those 20 questions, but if you go to the website, each of those warfighting challenges has 10 learning demands. That's a manageable number of 200 questions, right, across the Army. And so you can help us. Are we asking the right questions, right? That's the first important thing that we have to be able to do. And then if we've asked that question, we need to match that to a learning venue. Okay, where are we going to answer that question? And where we answer that question is in Force 2025 maneuvers. And Force 2025 maneuvers, like the Louisiana maneuvers with General Sullivan, and not the first ones, but the second Louisiana maneuvers with General Sullivan, what this allows us to do is to match all of our venues for learning. That's experimentation under what's called Unified Challenge. There's a big experiment once a year, but then there's a lot of really discrete, smaller, limited objective, experiments that go on at our battle labs in each of the centers of excellence. So we're crafting those learning events, those experiments, to answer the questions that will feed into our estimate, right? Our estimate of how well we can conduct operations to satisfy those warfighting challenges. This includes Unified Quest, which is the Chief of Staff of the Army's war game that looks out a little bit further, around the 2030 period. And one of the things we sent you for your feedback are the Force 2025 design principles. This is what we think the qualities that the Force of 2025 and beyond has to have. And so that's going to become our evaluation criteria as we, between now and December of 2016, we design the Army of 2030, a vision of the Army in 2030. And that's to check to make sure that what we're doing evolutionary-wise now is consistent with really where we think we have to be longer term, recognizing the uncertainty as increases as you go out further. The capstone event for this, and this is on your second handout, is the Army Warfighting Assessment at Fort Bliss. The first one of these will be this October. And this gives us an opportunity really to integrate not just new capabilities, although we're doing quite a lot this time on power and energy and our ability, the goal of going to sort of net zero for bases, local power generation, demand reduction technologies, so that we can satisfy the warfighting challenge of how to sustain high tempo freedom of movement and action at the end of extended and contested lines of communication in austere environments, right? High tempo ops at the end of extended lines of communication. And we're doing quite a lot with remote and robotic and autonomy enabled systems as well this October. So we have to learn, right, within these various venues, war games, experiments. Hey, but it's also what the Army's doing, Pacific Pathways, strong Europe, right? It's what we're learning on operations in Iraq today, where you're conducting security force assistance in institutions that are really battlegrounds between us and Shia Islamist militias associated with Iran. I mean, how do you do that in the future? So we're learning from what's going on today in exercises and operations and experiments and wargaming and applying it to our estimate in each of the warfighting challenges. And then, of course, we have to analyze. We have to analyze what we're learning and make sure that we're doing our analysis to the capabilities-based assessment level, so we can, on the back end of this learning, bridge into requirements that are approved and hopefully expedited, so we can build capabilities in our force. And so we do this with our analytical capabilities across our Army. The TRADOC Analysis Center does a tremendous job with this. Our analysts at ARCIC and in TRADOC broadly are at these learning venues now. And they're not doing a separate analysis to feed into the POM process. They're doing the analysis under Force 2025 maneuvers. And then we're using that data that we collect and the analysis we conduct to prioritize the capabilities that we need in the future. And then on the back end of this, obviously we have to implement. All right, so here under analysis, it's the capabilities-based assessment process and the capabilities needs assessment that prioritizes across all of the warfighting challenges. Implementation relies on us being an extension of the Army staff, right? If in TRADOC, we're operating separate from the Army staff, it's just an academic exercise, right? So the key is earlier in this process to build collaboration early. So what we want now, as we think, learn, analyze, and implement, is we need collaboration among the key stakeholders in the future force at the very beginning of this. And so what we're doing is organizing really teams that work on these warfighting challenges in a sustained manner over time. And so again, the idea is focused learning under the warfighting challenges, so focused on those first order problem sets, sustained collaboration over time. So we're learning cumulatively, not repetitively and episodically. And so there are 20 of these warfighting challenges for a reason. We do a focused study of each of those a quarter, 5 of them a quarter. And then we bridge into the Army processes, right? The Army plan, the POM guidance, and the POM offsite, which is coming up here soon. The long-range resourcing, work that we do under the LIRA. And then we also, though, if it's a high priority, really capability that we need, and we need to shift resources, then we tee those decisions up for the chief and the secretary as part of a governing process associated with how we think, learn, analyze, and implement. This doesn't change any of the Army systems. I see Joan Treffry right there, who I first learned about the Army systems from him in his office a few years ago. But it gets leaders involved in future force development in a way where they can establish and shift as necessary priorities. And so what has this delivered so far? I mentioned the improved collaboration among the key stakeholders, who are the requirements people, that's us at TRADOC, but it's also Forces Command, Army Service Component Commands, who are involved in this process from the beginning. We're working together in a way that I think has made us much more effective. It's working with the acquisition community, the research and development community, AMC broadly, as well as RDECOM. And it's the Army staff, the G3 and the G8. It's also the Joint Force. So we have now this venue, and you see the websites on here for the warfighting challenges, to have this kind of collaboration and to be able to do this work and to learn cumulatively over time. And so what we have been able to do is to break out to a certain extent of our cylinders of excellence under the warfighting functions, right? The way that we used to really look at combat development, future force development from a requirements perspective was within those stovepipes of intel, sustainment, fires, maneuver, and so forth. And the problem with warfighting functions as a construct for developing future force capabilities is that, it artificially separates those things which have to be routinely combined in combat and on operations. And so the collaboration that we're having now is really under these first order questions that have to do with what the Army's for, what the Army has to be able to do. And we're seeing tremendous payoff associated with that. So I just wanted to introduce this as maybe a conversation starter. The last thing I would ask you is please help us, right? We need your help with this. Those of you who are here from industry, those of you who have, I think there's extraordinary, obviously, military expertise and experience in this room. If you can get involved with our work on the warfighting challenges, send us your ideas about how we can partner more effectively with industry or take advantage of your expertise. I'd really appreciate it. So thank you.
Questions? With all that writing on the whiteboard? There we go.
Hi, General. Good to see you. Jen Judson, now with Defense News. You had told me in April that in Iraq and Afghanistan have sort of biased us in favor of focusing on protection and less on lethality and mobility. And you had also mentioned, in light of that you were working on a combat vehicle modernization strategy and that you were finishing up that strategy. So I'm just wondering if you had an update on that, if you can detail anything from that.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much for that question. All right, so what this has delivered, this process of thinking, learning, analyzing, implementing, one of the tangible products is the combat vehicle modernization strategy. The Vice Chief of Staff of the Army has signed the strategy and the rollout, essentially, or really getting that out to the Army broadly and beyond the Army is going to be at AUSA this year. But the outlines of that strategy is, the purpose of the strategy is to ensure that every formation, every combat formation in our Army has the appropriate combination of mobility, protection, and lethality to accomplish the mission under the mission variables, right? Mission, enemy, troops, terrain, time, civilian, considerations, that formation is committed. And so for example, we have said that what we have to address is the problem of lack of mobility for our IBCTs once they get, right? The great strategic mobility, the ability to respond very quickly, low logistics demand associated with that force, the ability to operate in restrictive and urban terrain. But the problem with the force is it lacks operational and tactical mobility. So as we looked at, for example, enemy anti-access area denial capabilities like you see in over the Baltic states or in eastern Ukraine, tiered air defense capabilities, shorter ship capabilities, and so forth, we know that we can't deploy into a predictable area, right? We have to go into offset objectives for early and entry operations. And so that force has to have a degree of mobility once it gets there. So one of our first priorities for the IBCT is to give it mobility. We will purchase in the next year or so 3 battalions worth of ground mobility vehicles. Now it's the same name as the SOCOM, but it may not be that same vehicle, right? We're looking across industry, off-the-shelf, capabilities that exist now. We've done some of the evaluation of those, and so that will be for early entry forces to be able to then move toward attack or assault positions and transition into dismounted, fire and maneuver against an enemy, or to control terrain after closing on that terrain from an unexpected direction. Now, that force, though, is going to be vulnerable on the march, right? I mean, you need to protect infantry on an approach march, whether it's dismounted or mounted. And so what we also need to develop and get out there is a light reconnaissance vehicle. This would be a vehicle to equip the light cavalry squadrons so that they can conduct offensive security operations to prevent the premature deployment or engagement of infantry as they're on an approach march, and to help them transition from mounted movement to dismounted fire and maneuver, and to give the formation the depth it needs to defeat enemy reconnaissance and all the things that you want a cavalry unit to do. So GMV, light reconnaissance vehicle. And then finally, when you're in close contact with the enemy in restrictive and urban terrain, you better have mobile protected firepower, right? And so we need to have a vehicle that can deploy quickly into an area, that has a relatively low logistics demand associated with that vehicle, and that can have the adequate protection, lethality, and mobility to ensure freedom of movement and action for infantry in close contact with the enemy. So that is going to be a developmental program. We think we're going to do an analysis of alternative and non-developmental vehicle study and take a look at what's out there off the shelf. We may try to buy a company's worth or maybe more off, from a GOTS, kind of solution or something, or COTS solution, but then to develop this vehicle. We have to do it, a lot faster than we have in the past. It can't be. We don't want to do this for 12 years. We want to go to prototyping much faster than we have in the past. Our requirements are very realistic for this vehicle. We're not going to ask for technology that doesn't already, have the level of maturity that can be incorporated into that vehicle quickly. And obviously, our TARDEC team and our PEO combat vehicle are trying to do everything they can to expedite this. So that's for the IBCTs. For SBCTs, we need to provide additional lethality to SBCTs. We have our strikers mount a World War II weapon system, essentially. And we're coming up against vehicles that far outgun them. Not that we want to fight a striker, like an armored vehicle, like a Bradley, but for encounter actions with the enemy and to support infantry as they close with the enemy across danger areas. You need a cannon, right? You need bullets that explode to suppress the enemy. What we want across all formations is a firefight ending capability, right? You shoot at somebody with U.S. Army on their chest, smoke and boots on the other end. We want as the effect. And so we want that from the squad level all the way up to, to our combat vehicles and formations. So we want to upgun Striker to 30 millimeter and with remote weapon systems, RWSJ's Javelin systems. So every other Striker will have a cannon, 30 millimeter cannon is what we're thinking, and a machine gun. And then the other Striker will have a Javelin remote weapon system and a machine gun. We want mobile protected firepower to develop in a way that maybe we could have a tracked or a wheeled variant, or if we have a tracked variant, that could be a tracked variant that could keep pace with Striker vehicles over operational distances, and then maybe the MPF solution could apply to Striker formations in the out years as well. For the Armored Brigade Combat Team, it's accelerating the AMPV to replace an obsolete piece of equipment, and then what we really need to do is try to, hopefully get some additional funding so we can develop a future fighting vehicle before the Bradley is completely obsolete. So the strategy describes all of this and what our priorities are. It has actually been, I think, helpful to the Army staff. Gary's here, who worked on this with us at G3 and the G8 team and PA&E. I mean, we've all worked to create opportunities even within this severely reduced modernization budget.
Sir, thanks for coming out today. As we think about thinking, learning, and analyzing across the Army, and we tie that to innovation, the view from your foxhole down at RKIC with other initiatives that the Secretary is doing with the DIE UX, and the one I hear about more and more here in town is this 18F, the Presidential Fellows and Innovation for Government. Right. How do we move forward together as a joint set of services and as a USG? Okay.
Well, I think, what we have done inside the Army, Aristotle said, focus on what you can control and he gets things done, So we have focused on really the requirements process and how we can streamline the requirements process. And then obviously we are very much interested in what can be done, for JSID's reform and reforms at higher levels. For the requirements process, what we've done is we have worked collaboratively much earlier in the process. So we're convening together what we borrowed a term from Google, called a pizza group, and this is really a group that you convene that is analogous to the number of people, or about the same as the number of people who you bring together to eat a large pizza, right? And so whenever we are developing a new requirement, first of all, we make sure we have the clear logic trail done. So you have a requirement out here on the far end. That requirement is tied to a solution approach or a DOTML-PF integrated solution underneath a warfighting challenge, which is then tied to a gap or an opportunity, right? In terms of a capability gap or an opportunity to achieve overmatch, which is tied to a required capability. And the required capabilities have been inventoried across the Army. We're sharpening the language for them, simplifying the language in a lot of cases, and we're connecting them to multiple warfighting challenges. So in terms of prioritization, that's going to fall out a lot easier, I think, for the Army staff, the G3 as they establish priorities, and so forth. So who do we bring together here? Well, you know, I'm looking at Tim here. You know, this is AC and RC together. You know, and the National Guard all working together. You know, on this at the very beginning. So this is the requirements community overall, and that's FORSCOM and ASCCs are represented there as well. We also have AMC, we have RDECOM, we have the Army G3 and G8. You know, in particular, we have the PEOs and the AUSA all community overall, and so you get the picture that this group coming together can really help determine and refine those requirements from the very beginning. We've had 2 rehearsal of concept drills for this. One has been on GMV, and the one that's going on now is mobile protected firepower. And it's working. So instead of TRADOC doing all this work on requirements, and then it going into the G3, who then gets that paperwork, and it goes from, you know, really if General Perkins approves this, a 4-star general to a council of colonels, and then starts the process over again, right? I mean, at times it would take 24 months to get a requirement, right? So anyway, we've focused on what we can do internally in the near term, and I think it's really paying off. And so I think if we can also then, you know, get some of the testing done earlier, you know, if we can compress some of those timelines, not to shortchange testing, we're full supporters of, you know, of making sure our soldiers have the equipment and the capabilities that they need. But really the timeline has gotten so long and arduous, and the process so arduous that it's difficult to again innovate, right? To stay ahead of determined enemies. Yes, sir. Okay, this is a great question. How does the combatant commander get into the pizza group? Well, first of all, we have really tightened up our relationship with the Army Service Component Commands, and all those commanders have done, I mean, just tremendous work to tie into future force development. So General Brooks, for example, in USERPAC has established it's called the EC cubed section. I forget what it stands for, but it's capabilities. It's future force capabilities, but it's a section on his staff who work with us on a continuous basis, and they're identifying capability gaps, whether it's Arctic, you know, capabilities for our forces in Alaska, or the mobile protected firepower capabilities that obviously have clear application for potential operations in Asia. Other capabilities, for example, oriented on the Pacific, are our ability to develop a long-range precision fire capability that is surface to surface, shore to ship, and also provides us an air defense capability, all in one self-contained battery. The convergence of what we're doing with radars, you know, for example, where, you know, we're not going to have a radar for airspace management and another radar for air defense and another radar for counterfire. You know, we're able to merge those systems together in a way that I think provides a lot of flexibility for a combatant commander in an area like the Pacific, for example. So we're tied in with the Army Service Component Commands. The conversations we're having with them, what we should start seeing is Army priorities for future force development matching the IPLs, the integrated priority list of the combatant commanders. And I think we've got a good path going with that. Certainly in Europe, I think you see that really with the capabilities we need with pre-positioned equipment, you know, for example, and to try to get core-like, you know, capabilities into that theater that would be necessary to set that theater quickly in response to Russian aggression, you know, for example. So I think obviously the Army staff very well tied in with the combatant commanders, the Joint Staff, and the Army Service Component Commands. But I think ARCIC and TRADOC are tied into them in a way that we haven't been in the past. Every time we have a future force development session, I didn't really bore you with all the governance stuff on implementation, but they are up on the VTC. And whenever we brief our assessment of a warfighting challenge, so every warfighting challenge has an estimate. Based on what we've learned so far, it has a learning plan, what we need to learn next, and in what venues, and based on that estimate, there are integrated DOTML PF solutions in the near, mid, and far term. Now those are not all on the unsecured nets and so forth, but and they're uneven, frankly. I mean, some are really good, some are not as good, and are maturing. But the ASCCs and the combatant commands and the Joint Staff as well. Down in Norfolk, and the J6 in particular, who has a lot of the interoperability responsibility in their Bold Quest we're all working on this together in a way that I think we haven't been as much in the past, and for good reasons, right? We were focused on getting to theater what theater needed, right? You know, and to prepare the next brigade that was going out the door. Our time horizon we looked at was very near term, right? And, you know, and it was adapting to the demands of the war, and that's what it should have been. I mean, you know, but now we're extending our planning horizon out more, and we're trying to build the force we need to maintain overmatch in the future. And that gets to the earlier excellent question about the combat vehicle modernization strategy. We did bias our efforts against the enemies we were facing in Iraq and Afghanistan in favor of protection, and we undervalued, I think, some of the improvements that we've not kept pace with, you know, in lethality and mobility.